The real issue in early January was, do we pursue the diplomatic track and see if the options for peaceful settlement are real? That's one option. The other option is we go to war and destroy two countries and create an ecological catastrophe and lead to who knows what monstrosities that follow. Those were the choices. But those choices were never presented because the possibility that there might be a peaceful political settlement, that was not even an option.
What role did television news play during the Gulf War? Did it really investigate events, allowing the audience to scrutinize government policy as the media is supposed to, or did it serve to assist the administration in gaining public consent for the war?
Although much has been made of the censorship used to limit the coverage of the war, our position is that television coverage is always already influenced by economic and political interests, that is, by corporate industry and government. Although corporations and government were not completely united in their position on the Gulf War, they comprise the sector of society which benefits most from controlling the oil wealth of the region. Within this context, television itself must be seen as a corporate industry, dependent upon advertisers, corporate profit margins, and most importantly, the need to sell viewers back to sponsors. In addition, TV news relies upon government for its major news stories and is wary of alienating its sources. How do these economic and political interests influence coverage?
I view it as an honor to be here, to come to Raytheon, the home of the men and women who built the Scudbusters.
The high-tech weapons have become the stars of the war. Tomahawk cruise missiles, the stealth...
There is a system of domestic power, that's not a great secret, that has an enormous influence on everything that happens in the society. It directly determines production, consumption patterns, and so on and so forth. It strongly influences, in fact, largely controls the political system, pretty much limiting it to two factions of a business-oriented party. And as far as the media are concerned, they are simply part of that system.
This is an ABC News special report on the Gulf War.
We are a public corporation. There are people who buy our stock asking us to deliver a return to them. I have always considered myself a banker. I am a banker. I am an officer of a company that uses other people's money and invests it. And we try to use it carefully. So I think it's wonderful that our news department is profitable.
And they are simply major corporations, parts of even larger conglomerates. Like any other corporations, they sell a product to an audience, to a market. The market in this case is advertisers, other businesses. And for the major media, the product that they sell is basically audiences and privileged audiences.
Ford is number one. Have you driven a Ford lately?
You say, okay, you are selling widgets, and your widgets are for the 18 to 49 population. We happen with this program, XYZ, to deliver 100,000 viewers in that age group. So every $100,000, for every 100,000, we're going to charge you $10,000, $15,000, $20,000.
Quite obviously, it's the news product is going to reflect the interests and the commitments of the sellers, the buyers, and the product.
Last night, America went to war.
This is the stuff of novels. Unfortunately, it is cold.
They present a picture of reality that conforms to the needs of power. And power in our own society happens to be largely vested in a state-corporate nexus. So that's the way, and as far as the Gulf War is concerned, that's the way the preliminaries to the war were presented. That's the way the war was presented, and that's the way the post-war period is presented.
The relationship between television on the one hand and government and corporate interests on the other is not simply one of direct control. In fact, audiences accept television news more easily if it appears to be objective and neutral. But these professional codes that result in what audiences perceive as objectivity and neutrality are what need examining, as they tend to present television's constructed view of reality as the truth.
There's no such thing as pure unmediated communication. Communication is always structured by particular codes and conventions, or by specific rhetorical and representational strategies, so that it's not so much what people say as how they say it that affects the meaning that we make. What can be most ideological about television news, however, is that it always works to deny that there's any mediation, that it's involving any kind of structure or conventions. And one of the key ways that that happens is by making it seem as if the anchor is talking right to you.
This newscast is also employing many of the same codes and conventions used in TV news. For example, our position as anchors leads you, the viewer, through the newscast and directs what you should look at next. In that way, we seem in control, paradoxically, even as we hide our control and seem to be depicting events as they are.
So the anchor does things like looks right at the camera in a direct address and uses personal pronouns like I and you and we. And all of that makes it seem as if it's direct kind of face-to-face communication and as if we're all within the we that he's talking about. What that does is it establishes this shared sense of complicity with TV, and it establishes this sense of sincerity. What the anchor does is kind of directs our look, kind of tosses his look and directs what we're supposed to look at so that he leads us along a particular path without it ever seeming as if we're being led, as if we're being directed.
For against that effort, and correspondent David Burrington has this report on what happened there.
We hope that through acknowledging the use of these conventions and revealing that we are not necessarily speaking an authoritative truth, we will suggest that this is always the case. In other words, rather than offering us a clear window on the world, we would argue that all television news offers a filtered view of reality. By offering this alternative view, we hope to encourage ways of watching television more critically.
In summary, we'll examine how television news covered the Gulf War. Our analysis will be framed by two questions. Asking first, how do corporations and government influence coverage? And second, how does TV work to gain public consent for government action by shaping viewers' understanding of world events?
Anxiously awaits as the threat of war looms over the Persian Gulf.
Whether war or peace prevails in the Persian Gulf region, the world will be watching.
Live special, When the Press Goes to War. Tonight, 6:30.
Any significant political decision deserves a thorough historical analysis. There was much that preceded Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990, and the subsequent massive deployment of American troops. However, television's so-called histories told us little about this context and tended to be either irrelevant or functioned as elaborate justifications for military action.
For centuries, American and European colonialists have walked all over the Middle East. A long history of colonial presence in the Persian Gulf is obscured by up-to-the-minute newscasts that define our knowledge of the Middle East. By filling news time with slick, aesthetic views of war, profit-seeking media corporations have silenced the debate on U.S. foreign policy.
But you really have to read the media, or any other product of an ideological system. You have to read it defensively. Most of the choices already are made before the information or the picture of the world is even presented. The choice is already made by the system of assumptions and presuppositions.
In this program, we haven't set out to do an in-depth historical analysis of the reasons the United States went to war. Instead, in the next 5.5 minutes, we'll begin to look at a few of the assumptions we felt the U.S. media left largely unquestioned in its coverage of the Gulf crisis.
The citizens of the United States were very uncomfortable with the idea that we would somehow sacrifice both U.S. lives and the lives of Middle Eastern citizens merely for an economic benefit. The White House immediately shifted their stance and began to try to portray Saddam Hussein as a Hitler, and to try to point out to the American people that we were not in it for the money, we were not in it for the oil, but we were interested in trying to stop aggression.
Saddam Hussein, in my judgment, is a reflection of our policy. Saddam Hussein is not a person. Saddam Hussein is a phenomenon which is reflecting us. Saddam Hussein is a mirror image of the U.S. policy.
You could have known long before that the Bush administration and the Reagan administration were doing everything they could to protect Saddam Hussein because he was just their kind of guy. And in fact, they managed to switch him from a Russian client in 1980 to a largely Western client by 1987 because they liked him.
The idea that somehow Iraq would cut off oil supplies in order to somehow deny the West those supplies for political reasons is really a ludicrous proposition. For single product suppliers, it's absolutely important that they be dependent on market forces. So Saddam Hussein, had he taken over all of the oil in the Gulf region, would still have to sell it, and would still have to sell it at market prices.
Ambassador al-Mashad, Iraqi ambassador to Washington, several months ago came to Harvard, and he was talking about the oil, and he said that if you are willing to sell oil based on the $18 of the previous invasion of Kuwait, we are not going to drink oil, he said.
It's not so much the access to the oil. You know, if we were on 100% solar, we'd follow the same policies. But control over oil production, pricing and levels and so on, that gives a certain leverage in world affairs.
The United States did everything within its power to frustrate a diplomatic solution to this problem. There were negotiations that had started within hours after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Nevertheless, every time one of these diplomatic processes got started, the United States essentially threatened our partners in the region, threatened the Saudi Arabians and the Kuwaitis with U.S. withdrawal if diplomatic solutions were to be pursued.
There was a debate over whether sanctions would work. There was no discussion over whether sanctions had worked. Well, the fact is, there's very good evidence that they had worked. At least it's very hard on other grounds to explain why Iraq produced a series of withdrawal proposals from mid-August right through early January.
It seems very clear to me that once Iraq had invaded Kuwait, the United States had already decided to go ahead with a military solution to the problem and was not going to be deterred by any kind of diplomatic moves.
As the threat of war looms over the Persian Gulf.
Whether war or peace prevails.
Why were these historical facts not presented on television? Why, in fact, if the coverage was to be balanced, were there so few anti-war voices heard? When protesters were given television coverage, they were represented as rabble or ragtag crowds. This undercut the credibility of the anti-war position, as such footage contrasted sharply with the images of military and pro-war experts.
And see how they're laid out. As you can see, from here to here is about 200 miles. That is the...
It's important to think about the use of experts on TV and the kinds of experts that TV news chose to interview, which were largely military experts. It's not that they never showed anything from the anti-war movement. It's merely that the way that they represented the anti-war movement always worked to invalidate or delegitimize that movement. They were always only shown as kind of crazed mob or, you know, people, holdovers from the 60s anti-war movement who had nothing new or interesting to say about what was happening now, as opposed to people who were authorized to speak to you, the viewer.
In San Francisco, the anti-war cause has been hurt by violent incidents. A police car burned, smashed windows along the demonstration route.
We will be right back after this important announcement.
The simple fact is, Ford is number one. Have you driven a Ford lately?
At least in the early days, the days leading up to January the 15th, before the hostilities broke out, the ads tended to be fairly standard in their format. One had got the sense that the advertisers hadn't rescreened the ads, particularly for the crisis. This means that they tended to focus during the news on the regular items, investment opportunities and so on, and tended to focus on to use slice-of-life scenarios to construct them. The Payne Weber ad, for instance, focuses on competition, aggressive, professionalized expertise. The Ford ad, though, is interesting in that it seems to begin to reflect the changing nature of the times. One doesn't know whether the ad was in fact written for the times. The words of the ad are, call it leadership, call it winning, call it anything you want. The simple fact is Ford is number one. And because this is written before the hostilities, what I seem to remember was that at that time there was a great deal of tension, anxiety among the American public. No one was quite sure how the events would turn out. So that when one finds an ad speaking of we're number one, it has a rather different ideological significance than it would have after the war, in which America had so brutally triumphed. At this stage, I think there's a great deal of anxiety about the ad.
It was after the deployment of American troops in Saudi Arabia and during the lead-up to the bombing campaign that the debates around censorship began. Given that television had failed both to cover anti-war positions and to give an adequate history of the region, one could argue that the fact of censorship had already receded in importance. Television censors itself in picking and choosing certain pieces of information over others, while at the same time covered this process of selection and presented it as truth.
At least since World War II, a set of ground rules
At least
emerged.
since World War II, a set of ground rules emerged, which the press readily and voluntarily accepted. Don't give away battle plans or number of casualties while the battle is raging, etc. The government broke with this axis in 1983 in Grenada. They imposed a total ban on entry and access of American correspondents to the battlefield. A great furor broke out and the government promised not to do it anymore. They proposed instead a standing pool system that would be given early access during any U.S. invasions. But in Panama, the next battle, the government failed to mobilize the press at all. 5 months after an investigation of what went wrong in Panama, the mobilization took place in the Gulf.
Most of which were not destroyed in the opening 24 hours of combat. The Pentagon also said, a senior Pentagon official said, it appears that the Iraqis fired 7 or 8 Scud missiles at Israel. And
the high-tech weapons have become the stars of the war. Tomahawk cruise missiles, the stealth fighter, the Apache, and the Patriot are working and devastating.
I view it as an honor to be here, to come to Raytheon, the home of the men and women.
It seems clear that in this war, as in Grenada and Panama, the government has continued to exert more and more control over the media. It could be argued, however, that the corporate interests behind the media bring it in line with government agendas.
In my view, there's very little censorship. And if, to the extent there is any censorship, the media accept it only by their choice. For example, during this war, there were journalists like Robert Fisk of the London Independent who just broke out of the press pool and went his own way. Nobody's putting him in jail. You know, The press, nobody told the press, suppress the Iraqi proposals for a diplomatic settlement. No one told the press when George Bush says there will be no negotiations, you're supposed to write an editorial lauding George Bush for going the last mile for peace.
But Saddam continued to talk of war. And
the effects of self-censorship and corporate economic pressure tend to be disguised for TV viewers. In fact, the endless debates over censorship and the media reinforces the notion that the media is usually free, thus validating its role as a crucial ingredient in American-style democracy.
Welcome to The Press Goes to War. I'm Bob Beckel for CNN. For the next half hour, we're going to take a hard look at the press coverage of the Persian Gulf War, now entering its 5th day.
Live special, When the Press Goes to War, tonight, 6:30.
It's a fair rule of thumb that anything that's widely discussed is probably unimportant, and that what you should look for are the things that aren't being discussed. If you want people to believe what they're presented with, you don't mark it authorized as truth by the state. You know, that's not a way to convey belief. What you do is present it as if there's a debate going on, and in fact, even with a debate going on, but ensuring that that debate keeps to very rigid presuppositions.
Images of American patriotism and nationalism were strong themes on the evening news. By constructing the United States as entirely benevolent and Iraq as evil, television supported the government's policy for war in the Gulf. But the effects of American pro-military sentiment were seldom connected to the lives of civilians in Iraq and to Iraqi Americans living in the United States.
One of the most striking features of the war was that as it unfolded, the public sphere of American society was increasingly taken over by the official line. What George Bush stood for, in fact, increasingly came to be measured in supermarkets, in parking lots, in the public sphere, generally, on television. Wherever one went, one was obviously accosted by cars, on the streets, by yellow ribbons. And the iconology of American official ideology, represented by flags and by the ribbons, in fact, was something that bore its way very much into everybody's imagination.
Lie yourself out in the lonely desert night. You know back home it's dawn's early light. It makes you lonely, but one thing you should know, we are with you wherever.
One of the consequences, obviously, of the colonization was that it became very difficult for people opposed to the war, of whom, of course, there were a lot, as we knew from the votes just before the war. It became extremely difficult for them to articulate their opposition to the war without being branded as unpatriotic or, in fact, opposed to the American forces, in fact, to be seen as pro-Iraqi. It became very difficult for them to find any ground at all from which they could speak their opposition to the war.
Lean on me.
There are some people in the world you do not want to depend on. Unfortunately, we lean on other countries for over 40% of the oil that America consumes.
Leaders have been represented as not to be negotiated with, as mad a lot of times, but as powerful.
To depend on unstable sources.
Somebody to lean on.
I think that reflects both, how we perceive Arabs as powerful, given that they have control over some resources that, are important to the West, oil, but also it reflects our misunderstanding and our cultural ignorance about the Arab world.
Well, Peter, Saddam Hussein now is prepared for war, but it is part of the Saddam Hussein mentality and the Iraqi mentality. His friends say that Saddam Hussein is not afraid to die, because if he dies, he will become a martyr hero in the Arab world.
Invoking the martyrdom theme, actually, I think, tends to mask the power relations that are really involved here. And I think when a third world country faces what is basically World War III, the people of that country are going to feel an allegiance to their leader, and are going to feel a loss if he dies, and are going to no matter what feel that he's won in some sense.
In this first program of our two-part series critiquing television's coverage of the Gulf War, we've concentrated on the period leading up to the bombing of Iraq. The next program will analyze how TV news covered the extended bombing campaign, the brief ground war, and the aftermath of the conflict.
I think what Schwarzkopf typifies is a new kind of general. He has a sort of dramatic persona of a Douglas MacArthur, the organizational skills of a Dwight Eisenhower, and that bonding with the troops of an Omar Bradley. Those kind of combinations are rare to come by, and I think in a way Schwarzkopf typifies both an older tradition of American hero-like qualities, and at the same time presents a new image as well.
I know that one thing that has been talked about is how Schwarzkopf sort of like, in a way, he's almost like a mythological figure.
The Schwarzkopf phenomenon is being analyzed with a more critical eye at Brown University. In a modern culture and media class, students are concerned that the general's charisma and charm might be desensitizing people to the horrors of war.
To those of us who are watching it on TV, he presents it in such a way that we don't see the bulldozers, bearing the trench loads of Iraqi soldiers.
And yet, when he talks about the Iraqis, he talks about them as sort of collateral damage. He's having compassion for the us, but not the them.
And I just as soon never lost a single life out there.
He does placate critical awareness. So I think that we have to be able to say, okay, he makes me feel good, but why does he make me feel good? And what is being hidden behind that sense of feeling good? What is the reality of war?
But the vast majority of Americans stand firmly behind the general. A Newsweek poll